Welcome to ESCoE's annual conference on economic measurement. We've done quite a few of these by now, and it's great to see many familiar faces as well as many new ones here. As many of you will no doubt be aware, there's been quite a lot of attention over the last year and a bit to UK economic statistics, as well as to the UK statistical system as a whole and its various parts. And amongst the many things you might want to take away from all this attention is that there is much demand for the important work that we are all doing to improve economic measurement and statistics, but also that there is much more work and investment needed. Much more work to support the development of theoretical concepts that describe the economy and their measurable counterparts. Much more work to make better use of new data sources, each of which brings with it a new set of methodological challenges that need to be resolved. And in this context, the importance of collaboration between academia and statistical agencies is clear. And that's, of course, the reason why you're all here, the reason for participating in this conference over the next few days, and for engaging in the many conversations that will take place. Conversations between the statistics producers, the statistics users, academics, and other researchers in attendance, and bringing curiosity and a research mindset to the development of economic statistics. Sadly, we are missing one prominent voice in this conversation. Vipin Arora, director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States, had to pull out of the program following the change in the administration there. And I very much hope that we will have the opportunity to hear from him at an ESCoE conference somewhere, sometime in the future. But I'm happy to share with you also some positive news from the US. There, the National Bureau of Economic Research, aka the NBER, is working to set up an economic measurement research institute. And I have it from Jim Peterba at MIT, the president of the NBER, that this draws directly upon the ESCoE experience in the UK. And that if they get this off the ground, there will hopefully be plenty of opportunities for complementary projects to advance economic measurement together. That's no small thanks to the efforts of the many ONS colleagues, academics and researchers at King's College London and elsewhere, as well as like-minded colleagues in government departments and international organizations who have been involved in developing the ESCoE initiative in one way or another over the last decade. So I very much hope that you'll enjoy the next few days, over which we have a very inspiring program on all things economic measurement, put together by our scientific committee chairs, Kevin Fox from ESCoE and UNSW, Liz McKeown from the ONS, and Paul Schreier from ESCoE and King's College London. So thanks very much to them. And finally, before I hand over to Liz to chair our first keynote, let me thank the ONS and King's College London for their sponsorship of this conference. Also, there's no planned fire alarm. If you hear it, leave the building and enjoy yourself in Covent Garden. Our colleagues are here in ESCoE t-shirts to help if you need anything. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Liz McKeown, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to our first plenary session of the conference. And delighted indeed to welcome Dame Carol Proper and to introduce her. She, as many of you will already know, is Professor of Economics at Imperial College Business School, a past president of the Royal Economic Society, and with her research focusing on financial and non-financial incentives on the quality of healthcare and healthcare productivity, amongst other broader interests. And we've got a really fascinating first keynote presentation to kick off the conference today. The effects of pension reforms on doctor labour supply, evidence from the English NHS. It will be really interesting to see how administrative data sources and an exploitation of the staggered rollout of those reforms allowed us to get new insights into labour supply. I won't steal any more of Dame Carol's thunder there, and I will invite her to the stage to give her presentation. Thank you very much.
to the organisers for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm giving something that's actually an academic research paper rather than a kind of overview. So I hope you'll kind of bear with me in that choice of what I did rather than a kind of overview of things. So please, I think it's quite a long slot we've got. If people want to ask questions during the talk, please do. I'm kind of, as an economist, I'm used to being interrupted. Especially when giving a kind of academic paper as opposed to an overview. So, well, let me see if I can get this to work. If not, I'll go down. Is there some reason why I've got a frozen screen? It worked before. Let's try this. I think this works and not the pointer. That's okay. That's fine. It was working, but isn't now. Okay, it's just, thank you. Okay, so as the title says, this is an investigation of the impact of a recent pension reform in the UK government on physician labour supply, and it's about the NHS and senior doctors in the NHS. The kind of backdrop to kind of why we were interested in this is that sustainability concerns about the financial viability of pensions has led to pension reforms across the world, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. But particularly for the public sector, that's led to reforming or scrapping generous defined benefit schemes where what you get is based on, say, the last 3 years in which you're in the labour market. Not only are those reforms intended to kind of improve financial viability, but they also are intended to increase labour supply incentives at younger ages, basically because schemes that are based on the last 3 years of your working life do not give much incentives for working further down when you're younger. So there's kind of two aims of these schemes. But actually, pension reform and analysis of pension reforms as such that they haven't really often looked at people who are younger than those coming up to retirement age. So the responsiveness of younger individuals to pension reforms is a reasonably open question. There's relatively limited research on that. So past research there's extensive research by some incredibly good people on pensions, and past research suggests that individuals may not be fully aware of their pension details, they may over-discount the future, they may have difficulty processing financial information. As I say, much of the kind of research, because it wanted to get at causality, has focused on individuals at or near retirement. So there's a very large body of research on those kind of individuals, much less on younger individuals and the incentives given to younger individuals. So this paper is intended to do that. It's a study of a major pension reform in the UK in the 2010s. Those of you who are academics in this room will recognise this reform, because a similar thing happened with USS. So essentially what this reform did, and it's not dissimilar to many other reforms that have happened, it replaced a final salary scheme in which the pension was based on the last 3 years of working with a career average defined benefit scheme, i.e. what you got was related to the whole of your working life. It also increased retirement age from 60 to 67. So I'm going to talk about quite a few institutional details because they're important, and all pension reforms have these kind of quite complicated institutional details. But basically what this did was it coupled a fall in the generosity of the pension, but importantly altered the link between pension wealth and labour supply at different points in individuals' life cycles. And it's that latter part that we're going to focus on. And within that, we're going to focus on a tightly defined, highly skilled set of public workers, NHS doctors. Those workers that we look at are sufficiently far from retirement to respond. They're important because doctor labour supply matters for healthcare provision. And the nice thing about this, as Liz hinted, is that the reform was introduced and implemented in a staggered way. So we can exploit that staggering to try and get at causality. I don't think I need to tell you why NHS doctors are important, so I'll kind of move on. So in terms of kind of a overview of what we're going to do is the impact of such a reform on labour supply is theoretically ambiguous, and I'm going to talk a little bit how it's theoretically ambiguous, but you should be pleased that I'm not going to present you with a lot of theory. But what we do is we exploit the staggered reform rollout to estimate the labour supply impacts of this reform. Then we use those to derive labour supply elasticities with respect to the pension return to work. So the nice thing about the design and the way that the reforms were introduced is the empirical approach allows us to control for the accompanying increase in pension age from 60 to 67. And as I say, this is important because many pension reforms have very complicated moving parts to them, often increasing retirement age as well as changing the terms on which individuals accrue their pensions. So the design that we have allows us to essentially not worry about the accompanying increase in the direct effect of the accompanying increase in retirement age. So in terms of kind of where I'm going and what we find is we actually find that NHS senior doctors increased their labour supply on the extensive margin. Essentially, they were less likely to leave the NHS. This is in complete contrast to what the BMA said before these reforms, which was that these reforms would cause mass layoffs or mass exits from the NHS. We find they didn't do that. They increased labour supply by a small amount, about 3% after 4 years, and about 8% after an individual was rolled onto the new scheme. And then from that, we can back an extensive labour supply elasticity with respect to the pension return to work, i.e. what your earnings do in terms of your pension pot, a pension return to work of about 0.1. So our conclusion is that doctors are responsive to the labour supply incentives brought about by pension reforms, but the responses are smaller than those to current wage changes, and in fact are smaller than the general population, and I'll talk about why that might be so. So just kind of trying to set this in a slightly broader context, what is the contribution of our focus relative to the previous literature? Well, as I say, there's a huge literature on the impact of pension reforms. But most papers focus on those near retirement and on retirement age increases. So there are often things like Social Security notches in the US which increase retirement age 1 year at a time. And a nice example of that is a paper by Richard Blundell about 10 years ago. However, a small number of recent papers have been able to examine workers further from retirement, and they've looked at several things. First of all, a change in the contribution benefit link, which is exactly what we're going to do. There's a nice paper by Bovini and another by Eric French. Eric French looks at workers in the Polish economy, where the Polish economy moved from a DB, a defined benefit scheme, to a defined contribution scheme. There are also papers that look at the impact of the change in pension age. And there's a very nice paper for Germany that looks at the change in pension wealth that arises because women in the labour market were given an extra pension dollop for the years that they spent in childcare. Our focus abstracts from the change in pension age for highly skilled and policy relevant workers. So that's the contribution to the sort of pensions literature, but we also contribute to the work on doctor labour supply. And interestingly, you'd think that doctor labour supply, since doctors are important, would be something where there's been a lot of work. Well, strangely, there's relatively little literature on that, and most of the literature is for the USA, where the incentives for doctors and the way they're employed is very different. Sorry. There's very little evidence from the UK, and what evidence there is kind of older. The Lee reference is actually not evidence, it's a summary paper, a review paper. The evidence is quite old and not very, I think it's fair to say, not very robust in terms of kind of whether it actually gets at anything causal. So there is work in countries with similar systems to the NHS, where doctors are employed in the public sector. There's some work for Norway and Australia. The difference that we're doing here is we're able to exploit reform-induced variation and provide a new focus on the importance of pensions / if you think, delayed remuneration, rather than remuneration today compared to that labour supply elasticities. Sorry, I've got terrible hay fever. So we examine most senior doctors in the NHS. What do we mean by senior doctors? We mean the guys and women who are called consultants, who essentially kind of run their departments and are senior in the NHS. This is about 42% of the total doctor labour force and about 8% of total clinical qualified workforce. These individuals are salaried public sector employees. They're paid on national scales, but they can get, so the national scales are set by the pay review bodies, as I'm sure many of you know, but they can get additional pay for additional responsibilities like management responsibilities. They can get pay for additional shifts, for example, working at weekends to clear waiting lists. And then they can get something called performance-related, which is sort of performance-related pay, known as clinical excellence awards, which are kind of awarded both at a kind of national level and a regional level. They can also work in the private sector alongside NHS work, or instead, about 20% of doctors do some private work, and I'm going to look at that a little bit. And there's a variation in availability of private work, both across specialties, so some specialties have a lot of private work, and also across geography, because the way where private facilities are located is essentially located to where the demand for private work is highest. That tends to be in higher income areas and in urban areas. So that's the kind of institutional detail. So now what about the reform? So I'm going to walk you through this reform. So the new NHS pension scheme was introduced in 2015. It was actually announced in 2012, which is important for us. And the new pension scheme that was implemented in April 2015 for the first cohort of people who were treated involves a number of changes. The first is a move from a final career salary, which was the best of the last 3 years, to a career average. But there were other bits to it. There was the change in accrual rules. So previously, each year you accrued 1/80th to your pension spot. Now it became more generous to 1/54th. The new scheme also uprated contributions by not only by inflation, but by an extra term. That's kind of relevant. The third part of it was that there was a later retirement age from 60 to 67. So that's a big change in the official retirement age. And the fourth part was there was no lump sum payment under the new scheme. So previously you were able to get a lump sum payment on retirement. In the new scheme, you could not. Those moved onto the new scheme were still entitled to their previous pension pot in the old scheme. But the nice thing about this scheme is also there's no changes to either employer or employee contributions. So nothing actually happens to the contributions made by either party. It's simply that the pension and the pension rules and the accrual rules change. So kind of moving on to thinking about how this reform might affect labour supply. So there are several components, as I say, to this reform with different effects. First of all, there's the big delay in the retirement age from 60 to 67. So essentially 60 was when you could first take your pension in the old scheme if you didn't take early retirement, and 67 is when you can first take it in the new scheme. So that means that your pension is received for a shorter time, and that's a pure wealth shock. That will increase labour supply of individuals if they haven't got anything else other than to work in the NHS. If the NHS is their only employer, we expect that to increase their labour supply, essentially, if they have no outside option. The second part is the change in pension value, which is due to the later retirement age, the change in pension value due to the change in accrual terms, and the move to the career average from a defined benefit scheme. So that does a number of things. First of all, it changes the return to working at a given level of labour supply. It essentially changes the extensive margin return to work. For those more than 3 years from retirement, it also gives an increase in returns to additional income that you can put into your pension. So there's a change in the intensive margin. But both of these effects have both income effects and substitution effects. So a priori, the impact of the reforms on labour supply is ambiguous. And we're going to be looking at this kind of second block of the change. Essentially, what we're going to be focusing on is what happens to labour supply in response to the change in the value of the pension, the change in accrual terms, and the move to career average. So as Liz said, we're going to exploit the staggered rollout of this scheme to estimate labour supply impacts. So the new scheme was actually announced in March 2012. And it applied to all public sector employees in some form or other. Doctors actually knew about this scheme in that there was a doctor strike in 2012 in response to this new pension scheme. So this was not this is a scheme that's known about 3 years before it actually comes in place. When it's implemented in April 2015, most existing NHS staff and most existing NHS consultants were immediately moved onto that scheme. But those people who were less than 10 years from retirement in April 12 were never moved. And those people who were 10 years to 13 years and 5 months, it's pretty precise, from retirement, were moved over time. Essentially, one birth month cohort, for example, those born in March 1968, were moved every 2 months. And this movement happened between June 2015 and February 2022. So essentially that rollout and that movement allows us a design in which we can essentially compare people who are born only 2 months apart in terms of their response when they move on to the new scheme. I'll give a bit more details of that. So for those in this room who are interested in data, what data do we use? And we use a data called the electronic staff record, which is absolutely a fantastic data set, which is pretty much underused. I think the Department of Health or somebody has had it for a long time, but has not really released it to researchers. But it's a payroll for all staff directly employed by the NHS. So if you think about being in a university, it's basically what you'd get as a university employee. It's payroll data. So from this payroll data, which is for everybody that's directly employed by the NHS, so doesn't include agency workers, we define a cohort of senior doctors who were working at the point when the scheme was announced in 2012, who were born between April 1962 and December 1969. That gives us just under 12,000 consultants. Of that group, individuals that were born between 1966 and October 1966 and December 1969 were immediately treated. Those born between April 62 and September 66 were staggered into treatment. And then we don't look at never treated doctors. We don't look at older doctors who weren't treated at all. So the fact that we're looking at basically people who were either treated immediately and comparing them to people who were treated over time, that eliminates these common anticipation effects that come from the big change in retirement age from 60 to 67, because all the folk we look at knew that was happening and are subject to that retirement age change. The flip side of that is, well, the other side of that is the narrow cohort means we only compare those born at least 7 years apart. And that kind of means that restriction to a small cohort means that we think that labour supply trends across different groups are likely to be more similar than if we look at obviously people aged between 30 and aged between 60. We have a sample period of April 2012 to August 2021. So it includes 3 years pre-reform for all of our treated cohort. So this is kind of a picture of, a table, not a picture, of the rollout. So we have a group who are immediately treated, those who were born after the 1st of September 65, and their pension in April 2015 would come from the new plan. Their pension in February 2022 at the end of all this rollout is also from the new plan. Then we have the staggered treatment individuals who are born between very specific dates, the 2nd of April 62 to the 31st of August 65. They're 40 to 49 in 2012. They were on the old plan, and then they're going to be gradually moved. They all end up on the new plan by February 2022. And then we have this group of never treated who are folk who are over 50 when the scheme was introduced. So essentially what that means is that we're looking at a cohort that has a mean age in 2014 of 48. About a third of them are female. Almost all, so we select the cohort in 2012. By 2014, 94% of them are still working in the NHS. They have a pay of about 121,000. They're pretty much all full-time, which I think is relevant here. So 90 conditional on being in the NHS still in 2014. They're about 98% of them work full-time, and almost all of them are in the pension scheme, have stayed in the pension scheme. So nobody really exited the pension scheme before the reform, or indeed exited the NHS in the group that we look at. So what's our kind of empirical strategy? And our empirical strategy is essentially a staggered difference in difference design. We're going to model the labour supply of an individual I who's born in birth group J in some month T as a function of whether they've been treated and the time since they've been treated. So that's this term here. So each B term measures the effect of moving onto the new pension plan H months after being moved onto it. Then we control for group, which is a birth month. So I say April 1967, say. We also control for time fix effects, which are month, and then we control for age times gender effects. And we use an imputation estimator that some of you may know that's proposed by Barusiak et al. Staggered diff-in-diff designs come in many forms, or rather the estimation for staggered diff-in-diffs comes in many forms. It's a very live kind of area of econometric research. There are a number of estimators that in theory we could use. The high granularity of our data kind of restricts the number of estimators that we can use to the Brusiak imputation estimator, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is how can we think about whether we're actually getting causal estimates, which for policy purposes we need. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room that. So what we have to assume is that all factors determining doctor labour supply, conditional on our rich set of controls, are uncorrelated with treatment timing, are uncorrelated with when an individual was moved onto the scheme. So we can control for age and gender because these are correlated with labour supply and the treatment date via the date of birth, and we allow for differences between men and women in that. There can be common anticipation effects for all those who are treated, since we only use the ever treated. So people can have common, across the groups, they'll all have common anticipation effects, for example, from the pension official age going from 60 to 67. Any time-varying common anticipation effects will be absorbed by the month dummies, and anticipation effects that are constant but vary across birth months will be absorbed by the birth month dummies. So the only threat to identification is some time-varying anticipation effects that are correlated with the timing of treatment. We test for that, and in fact we also implement OLS and get very different results. So we think that because we've got all these controls for gender times age, for birth month, for month dummies as well, we think we're pretty much identifying something causal. As you know, in economics, people spend a lot of time worrying about identification and causality. It's important because we need to know that parameters that we get for policy purposes are kind of causal and not just associative. So I think it's important to think about how this piece of, how we need to interpret this kind of reform, or rather, how we need to interpret the estimates that come from this reform. So the reform was well publicised in 2012. As I said, the doctors went on strike. All of our sample will be affected, including by the higher retirement age and the associated drop in pension wealth that mechanically comes from only getting your pension from age 67 onwards to getting it from 60 onwards. Yeah.
Did the people who, their previous accrual under the old scheme, they'd still change for that accrual as well?
Now that's a good point. Could you take it at 60 rather than 67? You have your pension pot sitting there. I think you can't take it till 67. But I'm not certain about that. I should know, but I just know that you have your pot sitting there and you can take it when you retire. The logic would be that you take it at 67, but it was the old scheme, so I actually think you could take it at 60. But I'd have to check that. That's a really good point. So, yeah.
Can I ask a slightly related question to Chris's question? Sorry, Jonathan Haskell from Imperial College. As you know, a number of the hospitals are teaching hospitals as well. Certainly some of our colleagues at Imperial are partly on the NHS.
Yes.
And then partly teaching.
Yeah.
And just purely anecdotally, so this may be an unrepresentative sample, the pension arrangements around the health service and the universities interact in very complicated ways because you've got a foot in both camps. Is that an issue?
No, I think the NHS pension scheme was more generous than the USS pension scheme, so I think they have to opt for one and not both. I think if you think about people working in teaching hospital, who teach as well, they have, if you like, more outside income than individuals who don't work in teaching hospitals. So that kind of may be relevant in the sense that they have more opportunities to kind of drop their NHS work and do more university work, or indeed some other work. We control, obviously, we do within hospital estimates, and they're very similar. So that suggests that, and those within hospital estimates will obviously include teaching hospitals as the within, and they are actually very similar to our main results. So I think that's probably not driving the results. Obviously, there are people, for example, if you work privately, you can also put your private income into a pension of some kind. So there will be people who have other pensions. But I'm pretty sure that most people would have planted their USS contributions into their NHS ones because the employer contribution is bigger for the NHS pension than for the USS pension. So you wouldn't really want to be in the USS pension, and you can port across government schemes. Thank you, though. I mean, yeah. So in terms of the interpretation, as I say, any effect of all of our sample are affected. Any effect of the reform announcement that's not time varying is mopped up by our fixed effects. So what we're actually capturing, and I think this is important, is the effect of being moved onto the scheme and then the path that you take after being moved. So these are the changes in financial incentives that occur only once you're moved. So now on to the kind of results. We're going to measure 3 measures of NHS labour supply, which we can do because of having the ESR. We're going to look at their total labour supply, the full-time equivalent hours worked, including anyone who's a zero. We're going to look at the extensive margin, which is a dummy variable for working in the NHS. And we're going to look at the intensive margin, the number of FTEs, full-time equivalents, that you do conditional on working. As you saw before, almost everybody was actually full-time. So these are our first labour supply results, and essentially we are testing for common trends in this bit here, which is this is months since the switch. This is going back 36 months. There are no pre-trends, so we don't think there are any different anticipation effects between those who are moved earlier and those who are moved later. Remember, we're only looking at people here who are moved. There's an overall increase in labour supply. For technical reasons, the standard errors get larger as you move out because there are less non-treated people from whom the imputation estimator uses them to impute the fixed effects. So 4 years after being moved, senior docs work about 3% more of an FTE, rising to about 8% after 6 years. And I mean, essentially, the average labour supply in 2014 was 0.91, so it's equivalent to a 3.5 or an 8%, nearly 9% increase. That's not nothing, given that these individuals are highly valuable to the NHS, and there's always complaints about doctor shortages. So then we look at the extensive margin. So this was total labour supply. The extensive margin looks pretty much the same. Essentially, all the changes are on the extensive margin. How do we interpret this? Essentially, there's mostly reduced leaving. So people leave less than they would have done had they not been moved onto the new scheme. There's nothing on the intensive margin. So people aren't increasing the number of hours they do, at least as indicated by payroll data, and you'd expect payroll data to be pretty good about hours because that's what pay is based on, especially for extra hours that individuals might be. So there's no significant change in the intensive margin. It's all on the extensive margin. People stay working longer for the NHS than they otherwise would have done. So contrary to what all the doctors' unions claim, there was actually an increase in labour supply when moved to the new pension scheme. As I say, it was driven by an increase on the extensive margin with no change on the intensive. Now, I'm not going to walk you through all the robustness checks. You'd be bored silly. but essentially we can shrink or increase our cohort. We can include the never treated, so the older people who were never treated, those over 50 in 2012. And the results are pretty much the same. As I said to Jonathan, we can include both hospital fixed effects and hospital year fixed effects, and the results are pretty much the same. And in fact, we get similar results with OLS, and I think the reason is that we've got a very saturated model with all these fixed effects that are going on. And that sort of gives us some comfort that we're getting causal results. Okay, so is there heterogeneity? Interestingly, there are similar results by different age groups, and there are similar results by male and female doctors. This is in contrast to most of the labour supply estimates, which tend to have different labour supply estimates for women and men. I think that, you know, if you think about this cohort of female senior doctors, most of them are working full-time by the time they're treated. And female senior doctors have, you know, long qualification periods. If you're staying in the NHS, you tend to work very much like a male doctor. But what there are is larger responses for senior doctors with fewer private sector opportunities. So those people who have, essentially, those people who have more private sector opportunities, which we define as being in a hospital where there are more private providers in your specialty, or in the specialty of the doctor, how we respond to, how we think this is, those people don't change their labour supply very much. Let me show you that actually, because I think it's quite interesting. So the people in red are those who have high private sector opportunities. The people in blue are those who do not have high private sector, and I've just collapsed these to yearly. And the way I interpret this is, those people with private sector opportunities have already kind of thought about a kind of portfolio of work. They've not changed anything. It's those doctors who would have left when they don't have the opportunity to do much private work, who would have left their NHS work, who stayed working in the NHS. So we've got these. We now want to use them. So we've got our responses of the labour supply changes in response to the pension. So it's a response to how your labour supply changes in response to these reforms. We now want to use them to try and derive labour supply elasticities. So we're going to treat the reform as a source of exogenous financial changes. But in order to relate the labour supply changes to derive labour supply elasticities, we need to quantify the financial impacts of the reform. And we're going to estimate elasticities by relating our estimates of the financial impacts of the reform, which we haven't used at all obviously in the estimation, to our estimate of the total change in labour supply in response to the reform. So what are the financial? So our labour supply elasticities capture responses to two financial changes. One is the extensive margin, the increase in the value of the pension if you work an additional year. And the second is the intensive margin, the increase in pension returns to current earnings if you're more than 3 years from retirement. We don't find any intensive margin effects, so we're going to assume that our results are driven only by the first financial change, the extensive margin change. And essentially, the change in the extensive margin incentive can be viewed as a change in the return to work, the return of what you're going to get when you retire in terms of your pension. So it's not the return to work in terms of current income, it's the return to work in terms of future income. So, what is that? So, essentially, we're going to calculate the change from the new pension plan in the discounted value of working an additional year. I'm not going to talk too much about the maths, but I'm going to talk about the terms. So there are essentially 4 terms in this financial calculation. The first is the accrual rate. As I told you, there's a difference in the accrual rate of 154 to 180 of the 2 schemes. Then the 2 schemes differ in what it's related to. So the new scheme is related to your age, so for every year. So this is measured at any age. For every year, you accrue into the scheme according to the accrual rate based on your current income. In the old scheme, you accrued based on your expected income in the last 3 years of working. Then there's another term. So in terms of this, the accrual rate, the higher accrual rate is more generous in the new scheme. The final salary scheme is, let me do the terms first. So the third term is kind of a slightly complicated term, which is to do with the uprating. So pensions are complicated, and they are uprated, your contributions are uprated usually for inflation. But in this case, it was not only uprated for inflation, but the new scheme was uprated more than inflation to compensate for expected wage increases for doctors, which actually didn't happen. So in fact, the accrual rate, the uprating turned out to be pretty generous. And then the final bit of this equation is to do with the fact that how long you take your pension for. So P is the probability of living up to some year, and then how long you're going to take that pension for. That's slightly different between the 2 schemes, because in the in the new scheme, you only get your pension from 67. In the old scheme, you got it from 60, and you got a lump sum. So we calculate the average value of each component, and that uses ONS life expectancy tables. It also uses, uses ONS life expectancy data, and it also uses the data on income progression for the doctors that we see.
On the inflation metric, was there any change from RPI to CPI?
Don't think so. I think between the 2 schemes, it's a good point. I don't think so. We spent a lot of time looking at all these pension rules. The fact that we have the same inflation term in these 2 suggests to me not, because we spent an awful lot of time working out all these components. So I think no at that point. So how do we calculate this? We need data on as I say, we need ONS life expectancy to be able to calculate this for everybody. We also need to know the trajectory of incomes. So once we've done that, and that we use that for on the never treated sample, so the older sample. So obviously the average value of each component is, there's a higher accrual rate. The final salary scheme is slightly more generous, the old one, but not that much. But this uprating term turns out to be very generous. And then the last term, which is the pension is taken over fewer years and you get no lump sum, is obviously less generous. So there's lots of components to this. When you work them all out, actually, the average change in the extensive margin incentive is a 33% increase. It's actually rather generous to the average person in this scheme. The average change in extensive margin labour supply is 3%. That's what I showed you before. If you divide one by the other, it implies an extensive labour supply elasticity with respect to the return to work of about 0.1. So it's positive, giving people more income in the future, or rather giving people a link between how they currently work and what they get in the future induces positive labour supply. It's a lot lower than labour supply elasticities from current income for doctors. Well, not a lot lower. Doctors have low labour supply elasticities, or at least the literature suggests they do, from about 0.1 to 0.5. we'd obviously expect less response to a delayed remuneration, a pension change, than to a current wage change. But also doctors are less responsive to this kind of pension scheme, and we can compare pension reform than the general population. We can compare, for example, with Eric French and co-authors' work, which looks at all Polish workers, where they find quite a much higher elasticity than we do. So let me conclude and leave time for questions. So the introduction of this more affordable pension scheme for the government provided NHS senior doctors with a higher return to work. They did increase their labour supply, driven by an increase on the extensive margin. Now, the design we have that looks just at this narrow seven-year cohort means that we can't identify what you might think will happen when you change the generosity of schemes, which it might affect younger doctors' behaviour. And it might affect, indeed, those thinking of careers in medicine. And we also don't look at, essentially, the impact of a later retirement age, except in as much as what you accrue in your pot is affected by that later retirement age. So there's lots of things we can't do because of our desire to be able to say something causal. I think the bottom line is that pension reforms can increase labour supply for a group who are probably more financially literate than the average population. Doctors spend quite a lot of time looking at their pensions and looking at their surprising amounts of time looking at their shares and other things that they might have. So pensions can increase labour supply for that kind of group. They're less effective than increasing a current wage, but they obviously have a lower upfront cost to the government than paying all doctors more. And I think at that point, I will stop and thank you, and hope you have some questions.
Thanks very much, Karen. If you want to...
I'll come and sit down, yes. I don't need to look at my slides to answer questions.
Well, I know people will be thinking of some questions. I mean, what a fascinating talk, both from the point of view... Interesting, actually, how little research that there is on labour supply for doctors. I mean, given that that's only going to get more press in with the dynamics of an ageing population. Also kind of interesting from a measurement point of view how little exploitation there's been of the underlying data set that you used as well, and interesting to think about other applications that there might be there. But I've also sort of noted that the pension reforms we've seen for doctors, they happened across the public sector, similar type reforms, and I don't know if you see applicability to your work for some of those other professions that also saw pension changes at the same time.
I mean, I think, I think in many ways in the public sector, defined benefit schemes were introduced in order to, partly just because schemes were more generous when they were introduced, but partly to induce people who are highly qualified to stay in the public sector, because compared to being a lawyer in the private sector, you earn a hell of a lot less in the public sector, compared to being a doctor who might work, not many doctors work totally in the private sector till they're kind of older. But obviously, being a doctor in the NHS pays a lot less. One of the flip sides of that is that you got a more generous pension scheme. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting that we do find that they respond in a way that you think they ought to respond, by increasing their labour supply and not decreasing their labour supply when, for fiscal reasons, you make those schemes less generous. So I think this could well apply to the same thing for judges, senior police officers, a whole cadre of people who have these schemes and have very similar schemes. One of the things we'd like to do is exploit the ESR data to look at other folk in the NHS, particularly nurses, who we expect might have different responses to this kind of pension scheme, because many nurses work part-time or not work less full-time than senior docs, and are probably less attached in some ways to NHS. These are NHS hospitals because they have other alternatives, as say working in the community or working for private providers where they perhaps have less shifts, which is one of the things nurses don't like.
Yeah, no,
understandably.
You can see many other sort of applications stemming from it. Let me take a few questions. I'm going to take a batch of questions at the same time. I'll start with Jonathan, Sanjeev, and then the gentleman there.
Thank you. Really, really interesting, Carol. Thank you. Could you just reflect a little bit more on what you were saying about the end, at the end, about how this is a group of very well-informed people? Can we draw any implications from that? And at the same time as there were these pension reforms, was there a kind of an information campaign or something like that as well? Because there's lots of discussion, aren't there, around public policy reforms to be accompanied by, letting people know exactly what's going on. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. I mean, they are well informed. What they probably didn't know about, or the interstices of this accrual rate, which actually made the change, as I say, gave a financial incentive of about 32%. If you didn't think about the accrual rate, and you didn't expect that to happen, actually our labour supply elasticity would be higher because you're dividing by a smaller, you're dividing it into a smaller number. So, in terms of them being well informed, the NHS pension provider ran, information sessions, just as those of us who are in universities had information sessions from our employers and from USS on what those changes to schemes would be. So I think, their employers had 3 years to inform them of this between 2012 and 2015. I think the BMA just looked at the change from 60 to 67 and the fact that they probably, I don't know how many of them knew how steeply or not career earnings were to affect this difference between the last 3 years and the career average. In fact, that isn't such a big difference. It's, as I say, about 0.9. Though obviously doctors do exactly the same things as academics do, which is they become head of department in their last year, so they can basically get £5,000 more and in that year, and then accrue it into their pension pot. So there is that behaviour too in docs. But I do think they are financially literate. What I think is interesting is that the BMA basically predicted all this exit, and there's no sign of that exit.
Great. Should we take a few, because I can see quite a few hands up. So we had Sanjeev, and then we had this gentleman here, and Joe in the front.
Sanjeev Mahajan from the Office for National Statistics. As civil servants, we've seen many reforms, and this idea of a 21-year-old starting today to work longer, pay more to get less is a real incentive. Lucky I'm not 21. But I want to pick up on, I think your presentation was really interesting, really intriguing, and trying to understand the drivers. You've got doctors who are a specialty. They've got private sector work, self-employed, and then they also work for the NHS. At the same time as the reforms in the NHS, how much of an impact do you think the pension schemes, which moved from non-contributory to contributory, which meant they had to spend more, relative to their private sector activities? Private sector pensions move very differently and sharply and quicker. Therefore, was there a relative incentive to stay with the NHS pensions? Okay. Because the private sector, your thinking is because the private sector pensions were becoming less generous. I think a lot of doctors who do private work don't necessarily save in pension schemes because they've got a generous NHS pension. What they do is these are companies, so they tend to take company profits rather than using them as a pension vehicle, because any pension scheme, I mean, they were getting 20% from their employer as a contribution. No private scheme was kind of offering anything as generous as that, particularly if you're buying it on the open market, because you're not buying it in a group scheme in any way. So I think the reality is that they probably weren't relying on their private
pensions so much as if they did do private work, on having that in shares, or lots of doctors have second homes that they rent, that kind of portfolio of investments. I mean, some of them own companies, but not many. I mean, actually own, say, device companies or are shareholders in device companies. But I think the pension bit, the private pension bit, when you've got 20% contribution by your employer and what was a very generous defined benefit scheme, is unlikely that you have high pension wealth. We don't know. I would love HMRC to be able to link my data. I probably will die before that happens, despite what anyone in the ONS says. But I'm very hopeful. I would really like to see the income that doctors have on the other side. All we can do here is know about private sector opportunities, because we don't want it to be too endogenous. So we take private sector opportunities in the area for your specialty.
I'm sure it won't be the first request for a linked data set that we get in these next few days. So note that
getting in early.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brenna Casey, I want to get back to doctors. One of the things which happened 2 or 3 years ago, it was very noticeable, was the issue of the size of the total pensions pot, which doctors had accrued, and the fact that that was capped by government so that you could not acquire a pension pot that is greater than so much without paying taxes on it. 2 or 3 years ago, there was much discussion about that, particularly those of us who read the Financial Times, and we were also aware that the person who was writing the Financial Times articles about this was actually married to a hospital consultant. So there was a very specific interest. There was a discussion about people refusing to take on additional work, stopping completely. That is not something which you talked about here. I had a second experience of this because a colleague of mine had actually worked on the Armed Forces Pensions Review, and whilst I was talking about doctors, he suddenly brought up rapid promotions of senior military staff who in fact were going to incur substantial losses as a result of taking the promotion. You didn't talk about this, but could you talk about because this seems to be highly relevant as well. Thank you.
There are 2 pension changes that are across the board that Treasury put in. One is the annual allowance, how much you can accrue in any 1 year, and one's the lifetime allowance. And both of them happen in this period. It's not just 2-3 years ago, it's actually some time ago. The point about our design is all individuals in our design are affected by this. And since we compare somebody who's essentially pre-movement of scheme in April 2017 with somebody's behaviour in June 2017, once they're moved onto the scheme, those kind of common pension reforms, which were big, do not affect our estimates. So they're netted out by the design that we have. This staggered diff in diff design allows for those other changes. Now, in order for our estimates not to be causal, you'd have to assume that the exact timing of treatment, which depends on your birthday, was correlated with different behaviour with respect to, so it's the exact timing of treatment with respect to those AA and LTA changes. And we think that's very unlikely because, as I say, the design essentially compares the behaviour of someone born in April in 1 year with someone born in June another year when one of them has been moved onto the scheme and the other hasn't. It's a good point. Those things are kind of going on in the background. That's what's nice about our design. We've also got month time dummies. So any announcement of this will be sucked up in the month time dummies.
Genius design. I had Joe, then Martin, and then the gentleman over there. So Joe, I think a mic's come in.
Very nice paper indeed, and very neat and very well structured for the reasons you said. My question really you partly dealt with, but I'm not sure as fully as I mean, why did the BMA get it wrong? It's not just, as I would imagine, that they looked at any part of the scheme and not the rest. They're usually pretty sophisticated about that sort of thing. If part of the reason is the up ratings corresponding to pay rises that actually didn't happen, does that actually mean overall the scheme was financially more affordable from the government's point of view, or was it actually more expensive in the event?
It's a good point, Joe. You always ask difficult questions. The scheme, it probably, I mean, given that they were paying less than they thought they were going to all doctors, but the up rating was more generous, but only applied to people who are accruing pensions. My guess is that the net cost of all of this was more affordable for the government. Whether the extra accrual rate can be seen as bribery for not getting, it's not very clear why there was this more generous accrual rate. It was that the sort of literature on this suggests that it was because there was an expected rise in salaries that didn't happen. But you probably know more about this than I do. I don't actually know why that was so generous.
Did the BMA not expected that?
The BMA, I don't think, expected that, no. I mean, it's interesting. You know, you say that BMA is well informed. They do very little analysis. They don't have access to these data. They obviously know about, they know about pressure from various groups, particularly, for example, junior docs, Senior docs tend to make less fuss. The consultants tend to make less fuss generally than the junior docs. Not surprisingly, because the junior docs have got years of being employed in a sector they think is kind of going down the tubes. Well, that's a bit over exaggerating, but a sector in which working conditions are getting less good. So, when we talked to the BMA about this, they didn't do any kind of deep analysis. I do think they were very much led by what people were telling them. And I think very much led by this big change from 60 to 67, which isn't what we're estimating here. That's kind of netted out because everyone has it. So I can't really tell you why everybody went on, or the BMA got everybody to, or the BMA was, saying things that made everyone go on strike, or a large number of people go on strike in 2012 in response to this.
Interesting. Martin.
Martin Wheel, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. One minor point, I wonder whether you're understating the survival rates of both populations. Most of the evidence, I think, suggests that well-educated, well-paid people survive longer than average. And when you use the ONS life tables, you're looking at the average. The Institute of Actuaries, or Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, does do a continuous mortality study, and there might be something there that you could use that would be a bit more representative of this population.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I mean, in a sense, if they make it to 67, then the twos that, we've got it wrong in both, but yes, I totally, if they're living till 88. If they're only living till 70, then that difference between 67 and 70 and 60 and 70 in our calculations would be an underestimate. To the extent that they live a long time, then with the discount rate and stuff. But I take your point, we could do that. We could look at doctors, at skilled labour, because they do live longer than the general population.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've got the gentleman there.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could relate some of your findings to, theory. On the one hand, you could interpret this as, simply increasing remuneration means increase of labor supply, which makes perfect sense. But at the same time, you could also think that if people discount future income very highly, not enough that your marginal cost is such that your marginal cost for extra work is still low than it, and there's no fallback position, then you would also expect to see a higher supply if you think that actually pay went down. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of, obviously, the net effect of this has both an income effect and a substitution effect. But, I mean, you're right that we would expect a response to delayed remuneration, i.e. accrual in your pension pot from working an extra year, to be less than a response to current income, regardless of what current income, I mean, less of a response to current income. I don't know whether I'd say more than that, in the sense that I don't think theory tells me much more than delayed remuneration, because it's discounted, is obviously going to be less valuable to me than current. And therefore, regardless of which way I think the income and substitution effects go, I'd expect the response to be lower, either way.
We've got time for one last question. So has anyone got a pressing question? I think the gentleman here got in first.
Thank you, Carol. It's Chris Giles from the Financial Times. I just wanted to take you slightly outside your model. Given that the really massive change in these pension reforms was from 60 to 67, and that was a big negative income effect for doctors, what do we know about whether they worked a lot more and further because of that? And does that dominate the results that you've given here?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, that's not something that we can look at causally because of given that essentially we see no change in, for example, those who have outside private income and those who have, and a positive change with most people still working full-time for the NHS. I think that the 60 to 67 has not caused vast amounts of change. And in fact, you can look at that. So doctors' retirement for the group who are not affected by the notch effect of the reform, are not affected by the reform at all, basically kind of slopes gradually downwards from 55 through to about 65. There's no great cliff edge at 60, which was the retirement age and remains the retirement age for those folk. So sort of by pulling that backwards, I think probably there wasn't. We can't see a big sea, we see more in our estimates, and we can't see a big sea change in the raw data for this cohort that we look at compared to the ones above. So I think, although it did change, obviously that, you know, the size of your pension pot has decreased mechanically by having only from later onwards. It doesn't seem to have, in the cohort that we look at, massively changed labour supply, just in the raw data.
Thank you so much, Carol, for a fascinating presentation and answering all those varied questions and getting, I think, we can all agree, the conference off to an excellent start. So let's show our appreciation. And the only thing I have to announce now is it's lunch next, and there's 2 spots for lunch given the inclement weather today. Where we had coffees on arrival is one potential spot, and the other is outside Lecture Theatre 1. So either of those, now's the time to enjoy lunch and no doubt carry on talking about some of the interesting insights that we've got from today's presentation. Thanks, Carol.